Sometimes the bravest person in the room is the one everyone underestimated, and before the sun set that afternoon, an ordinary act of kindness would quietly change the lives of everyone inside that bakery. The smell of fresh bread and warm cinnamon drifted through one of Manhattan's most elegant neighborhood bakeries as customers filled every polished table with cheerful conversations and expensive coffee orders. Crystal display cases sparkled beneath soft golden lights, while carefully arranged pastries reflected the perfection the shop had become famous for. Hannah Brooks stepped inside carrying a worn canvas handbag and a hopeful smile. She had just finished a job interview across the street and decided to spend the last few dollars in her wallet on a simple cup of tea before heading home. Although her plus-size figure often attracted unwanted attention from strangers, Hannah had learned long ago that another person's opinion could never define her worth. She quietly joined the line, admiring the beautifully decorated desserts while mentally calculating how much she could afford. A few feet away, an elderly woman wearing a modest gray coat stood patiently beside the pastry display. Her silver hair was neatly arranged, and despite the elegance with which she carried herself, her clothing suggested simplicity rather than wealth. She smiled gently at the young cashier while asking whether there was a smaller loaf of bread available because she lived alone and disliked wasting food. Before the cashier could answer, a sharply dressed customer sighed loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. He complained that people who could not afford premium bakeries should shop somewhere else instead of slowing down the line. Another woman laughed quietly before remarking that expensive places should maintain a certain image if they wanted to keep respectable customers returning. Within seconds, uncomfortable silence spread across the bakery. Several people lowered their eyes toward their phones. Others pretended not to hear the conversation at all. The elderly woman politely apologized, explaining that she would only need another moment before making her selection. Her calm voice carried no anger, only quiet embarrassment. Hannah watched the entire exchange from the back of the line. She noticed the trembling hands hidden beneath the older woman's sleeves, the forced smile attempting to hide wounded dignity, and the painful silence from everyone who chose comfort over compassion. Without hesitating, Hannah stepped away from her place in line and walked directly toward the elderly woman. Standing beside her with quiet confidence, she looked at the impatient customers and spoke in a calm, respectful voice that carried through the entire bakery. She said there was nothing embarrassing about growing older, living modestly, or taking an extra moment to choose a loaf of bread. She reminded everyone that kindness never delayed anyone nearly as much as cruelty did. The bakery became completely silent. Some customers stared at Hannah with disbelief, while others exchanged uncomfortable glances. One man looked at Hannah before smirking that perhaps she should worry less about defending strangers and more about herself. A few people laughed softly at the remark, allowing the mockery to shift from the elderly woman toward Hannah. She heard every word, yet never stepped away. Instead, she gently turned back toward the older woman and asked which bread she had wanted to try. The elderly woman's eyes shimmered with quiet gratitude as she whispered a heartfelt thank you. Hidden beyond the bakery windows, an unmarked black sedan had just pulled into a nearby parking space. Inside the vehicle, a professional driver witnessed the entire scene through the glass before reaching for his telephone. What none of the people inside the bakery realized was that the woman standing beside Hannah was far from ordinary, and the phone call being placed at that very moment would soon bring someone whose arrival would make every careless word impossible to forget. The quiet courage Hannah Brooks had shown only moments earlier should have ended the uncomfortable scene. Yet kindness often carries a price before it receives respect. The sharply dressed customer folded his arms and laughed softly, drawing the attention of nearly everyone inside the bakery. He remarked that people who looked like Hannah should avoid giving lessons about dignity because they clearly had enough problems of their own. Another customer smiled with quiet amusement before adding that perhaps the bakery should begin serving oversized portions if it wished to satisfy every guest standing there. A few uneasy chuckles spread through the room while others stared down at their coffee cups, unwilling to defend either woman. Hannah heard every word with complete clarity, but her expression never changed. She had spent years learning that responding to cruelty with anger only allowed cruelty to grow louder. Instead, she looked at the elderly woman beside her and gently asked which loaf of bread smelled the freshest. The simple question broke the tension for only a moment. The older woman smiled faintly and pointed toward a rustic sourdough resting behind the glass display. Hannah asked the cashier to wrap it carefully before quietly reaching into her handbag. She counted the bills inside one by one. The money she carried had been set aside for bus fare, a modest lunch, and the cup of tea she had planned to enjoy after an exhausting morning of job interviews. Without hesitation, she placed every dollar on the counter and asked the cashier to include the bread along with 2 cups of hot tea. The young cashier looked uncertain before quietly explaining that the total was slightly higher than the amount Hannah had placed on the counter. Hannah smiled apologetically and said that was perfectly all right. She would simply skip the tea and purchase only the bread. Before the cashier could respond, the elderly woman gently reached into her own handbag, intending to contribute the remaining amount. Hannah softly placed a hand over the older woman's wrist and kindly insisted that today she deserved to be treated with the same generosity she had probably shown others throughout her life. The bakery grew strangely quiet once again. Even several people who had remained silent earlier now watched Hannah with growing curiosity. She had every reason to walk away after becoming the target of ridicule herself, yet she continued protecting someone she had met only minutes earlier. The elderly woman's eyes filled with gratitude as she accepted the wrapped loaf of bread with trembling hands. She quietly thanked Hannah, asking why she would sacrifice so much for a complete stranger. Hannah answered with gentle honesty that many years earlier her own grandmother had taught her a lesson she never forgot. She said that whenever a person's dignity is being taken away, anyone standing nearby has only 2 choices. They either become part of the cruelty or part of the courage. She had promised herself long ago that she would always choose courage. Outside the bakery, the driver inside the black sedan lowered his telephone after finishing a brief but urgent conversation. He glanced through the window once more, watching Hannah speak with calm sincerity while the elderly woman listened with quiet admiration. The driver understood exactly who the older woman was, and he also knew the man now driving toward the bakery rarely changed his schedule for anyone. Inside, the elderly woman looked thoughtfully at Hannah before asking whether she had somewhere important to be. Hannah laughed softly and admitted that she had probably already missed the city bus she intended to catch home. She said it was only a small inconvenience because another bus would arrive eventually. The elderly woman smiled, deeply moved by the answer. She had spent a lifetime meeting people impressed by influence, wealth, or appearances. Standing before her now was someone who possessed none of those things, yet carried a kind of quiet character that could never be purchased. Neither woman noticed the black luxury sedan coming to a smooth stop outside the bakery entrance, and neither realized that the next person to walk through those glass doors would quietly change the course of every life inside the room. The bell above the bakery door chimed softly as the black luxury sedan came to a graceful stop outside, yet no one inside paid much attention. Manhattan was full of expensive cars, and another elegant vehicle hardly seemed unusual in a neighborhood known for wealth and influence. Hannah Brooks remained focused on the elderly woman beside her, carefully carrying the wrapped loaf of bread and leading her toward a quiet table near the front window. Steam rose gently from 2 fresh cups of tea after the cashier quietly decided to pay the remaining balance himself, deeply moved by everything he had witnessed. Hannah thanked him with genuine warmth before helping the older woman take a comfortable seat. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, bathing the small wooden table in a soft golden glow while the noise inside the bakery slowly returned to normal. The customers who had mocked both women continued whispering among themselves, although their voices had grown noticeably quieter. Hannah smiled as she slid one of the cups across the table. The elderly woman wrapped both hands around the warm porcelain, taking a slow breath before thanking Hannah once again. She admitted that very few strangers would have risked becoming the target of ridicule simply to defend someone they had never met. Hannah laughed gently and confessed that courage rarely felt courageous while it was happening. Most of the time, she explained, it simply felt like doing the only thing her conscience would allow. The elderly woman studied Hannah with thoughtful eyes before asking whether life had always been so kind to her. Hannah looked out the window for a brief moment, watching yellow taxis move through the busy afternoon streets before quietly shaking her head. She explained that after losing her grandmother several years earlier, She had promised herself never to ignore another lonely person again. Her grandmother had spent the final years of her life feeling invisible whenever she entered crowded places. People rushed past without making eye contact. Some judged her appearance before hearing her voice. Hannah said she still remembered how much a single kind smile had meant to her grandmother during difficult days. Since then, whenever she saw someone standing alone against unnecessary cruelty, walking away had never felt like an option. The elderly woman's eyes glistened as she listened. She reached across the table and gently squeezed Hannah's hand without saying a word. At that exact moment, the bakery door opened once more. A tall man wearing a charcoal overcoat stepped inside with calm confidence. He carried himself with quiet authority rather than dramatic presence, and although nothing about his appearance demanded attention, several employees instinctively straightened the moment they noticed him. He briefly acknowledged the driver waiting near the entrance before allowing his eyes to scan the room. They rested first on the elderly woman, confirming she was unharmed. Only then did they shift toward Hannah, who remained completely unaware of who had just entered. She continued speaking softly, telling the older woman that kindness never required permission and that people often underestimated how deeply small acts of compassion could change another person's day. The man remained silent, observing the conversation from several feet away. He noticed the untouched cup of tea placed before Hannah, the nearly empty wallet resting beside her handbag, and the peaceful smile she wore despite everything that had happened. He also noticed the uncomfortable expressions spreading across the faces of several customers who suddenly seemed eager to avoid his gaze. The atmosphere inside the bakery subtly changed, though Hannah did not yet understand why. She simply continued treating the elderly woman with the same warmth she would have offered anyone else. Standing quietly near the entrance, the man realized something before speaking a single word. Long before he had arrived, someone else had already protected the person he valued most, and she had done so without expecting recognition, reward, or even the smallest expression of gratitude. The tall man remained near the entrance for several quiet seconds, allowing the peaceful conversation to continue without interruption. His calm eyes never left the elderly woman seated beside Hannah Brooks, and the relief that briefly crossed his face was almost impossible to notice. Eleanor DeLuca looked up first. The gentle smile that appeared the moment she recognized him carried the unmistakable warmth only a mother could express. She gave the smallest shake of her head before he could take another step, silently asking him not to reveal anything yet. Vincent DeLuca understood immediately. Throughout his life, his mother had valued sincerity above appearances, and she wanted a few more moments to see Hannah exactly as she truly was, untouched by status or influence. Vincent honored her silent request without hesitation. Instead of approaching their table, he quietly walked toward the counter and thanked the young cashier for preparing fresh tea. The cashier nodded nervously, suddenly aware that the quiet customer standing before him carried an unmistakable presence that demanded respect without asking for it. Across the room, Hannah noticed the man only briefly before returning her attention to Eleanor. She apologized for speaking so much about her grandmother, explaining that certain memories still found their way into ordinary conversations. Eleanor smiled softly and replied that the people who shaped our hearts never truly left us. She then asked Hannah whether she had family waiting for her at home. Hannah admitted that life had become fairly quiet after losing her grandmother. She rented a small apartment, searched for steady work every week, and volunteered whenever she had free time at a neighborhood senior center, because spending time with older people reminded her of the woman who had raised her. She laughed gently before adding that kindness cost nothing, yet somehow remained one of the rarest things people offered freely. Eleanor lowered her eyes for a brief moment, deeply moved by the honesty in those words. Nearby, the customers who had mocked both women earlier continued whispering among themselves. Several glanced repeatedly toward Vincent, trying unsuccessfully to determine why his arrival seemed to change the atmosphere inside the bakery. The manager quietly stepped from the office after recognizing him and offered a respectful greeting. Vincent acknowledged him with a courteous nod, but made no effort to draw attention to himself. Everything about his behavior reflected patience rather than authority. He wanted to understand what had happened before speaking a single sentence. The driver approached discreetly and handed Vincent a small envelope containing notes he had written after witnessing the Confrontation from outside. Vincent read only a few lines before folding the paper and slipping it into his coat pocket. Every detail confirmed exactly what he had already observed with his own eyes. Hannah had defended his mother without hesitation, accepted ridicule without responding in anger, and sacrificed the last money she carried simply to preserve the dignity of someone she believed was alone. At the table by the window, Eleanor suddenly looked toward Vincent and smiled warmly. She invited him to join them for tea, introducing him to Hannah only as her son who had come to drive her home. Hannah immediately stood to greet him with the same genuine respect she had shown everyone else. She apologized if she had kept his mother waiting and explained that they had simply been talking. Vincent met her kind eyes for the first time and thanked her quietly for keeping his mother company. There was no trace of arrogance in his voice, only sincere gratitude that seemed almost surprising coming from someone so composed. Hannah smiled modestly and replied that anyone would have done the same. Eleanor and Vincent exchanged a brief glance filled with silent understanding. They both knew that statement was not true, because only one person inside the bakery had actually stepped forward when kindness had been needed most. Outside the windows, late afternoon sunlight stretched across the sidewalk as more black vehicles quietly arrived one after another, unnoticed by Hannah, but impossible for everyone else inside the bakery to ignore for much longer. The quiet conversation at the small table by the window continued for another few moments, yet the atmosphere inside the bakery had already begun to change. Through the wide glass windows, several black luxury vehicles came to a smooth stop along the curb. Their polished doors opened almost simultaneously as professionally dressed security personnel stepped out with calm precision, never creating unnecessary attention, but quietly positioning themselves around the entrance. The conversations inside the bakery slowly faded. Customers who had once spoken confidently now exchanged uncertain glances, trying to understand why. Such an impressive motorcade had arrived at an ordinary neighborhood bakery. Hannah Brooks noticed the movement outside only briefly before turning back toward Eleanor with a warm smile. She assumed an important business executive had simply stopped nearby for coffee. Vincent DeLuca remained completely composed. He showed no interest in the curious stares surrounding him. Instead, he reached for his mother's empty teacup and gently asked whether she would like another refill before they left. Eleanor smiled proudly at the simple gesture. No matter how powerful her son had become, he had never forgotten the small acts of respect she had taught him as a child. The bakery manager hurried forward, his expression suddenly filled with nervous concern. He addressed Vincent with unmistakable respect, asking whether everything inside the bakery had been satisfactory. Several customers immediately noticed the change in his tone. The same manager who had remained silent while Eleanor was being humiliated now stood noticeably anxious before the quiet man seated at the table. Vincent thanked him politely and replied that the tea had been excellent. Then he calmly added that there was, however, one matter he hoped they could discuss before anyone left. The room fell silent once again. Hannah looked toward Vincent with mild curiosity, still believing he intended to mention ordinary customer service. Eleanor quietly folded her hands and watched without interrupting. Vincent slowly stood from his chair before turning toward his mother. His voice remained gentle as he asked whether she had been treated with kindness before he arrived. Eleanor looked at Hannah first, her eyes filled with gratitude, before answering honestly that one stranger had treated her with remarkable kindness, while several others had chosen something very different. Vincent nodded slowly, as though confirming something he already knew. He then looked toward Hannah and thanked her once more for standing beside his mother when no one else would. Hannah smiled modestly and replied that she had simply done what anyone should have done. Vincent answered softly that the world would be a much better place if that were true. The customers who had mocked both women earlier suddenly grew very still. Something about the conversation no longer felt ordinary. The manager swallowed nervously as several employees quietly gathered behind the counter. Finally, Vincent turned back toward Eleanor and spoke the words that instantly transformed the entire bakery. "Mom, I am sorry I was not here sooner." The sentence hung in the air like complete silence itself. Every face in the bakery seemed to freeze at once. The sharply dressed customer who had mocked Eleanor stared at Vincent with widening eyes before slowly looking toward the growing line of black vehicles outside. Recognition spread across the room one expression at a time. Whispers began moving from table to table as someone quietly spoke Vincent DeLuca's name. Hannah blinked in surprise, looking from Eleanor to Vincent as the truth slowly settled in. The gentle woman she had defended was the mother of one of the most respected and powerful mafia bosses in the city. Yet the greatest surprise was not Vincent's identity. It was that his first concern had never been his reputation, his influence, or the people who had shown disrespect. His only concern had been the dignity of the mother sitting quietly beside him and the courageous stranger who had protected her without ever asking who she was. Silence settled over the bakery with a weight no one had expected. The whispered recognition of Vincent DeLuca's name spread quietly from one corner of the room to another until even the customers who had arrived only minutes earlier understood that the man standing beside Eleanor was no ordinary son. Yet Vincent showed no interest in the uneasy expressions surrounding him. His attention remained fixed on the two women seated before him. He looked first at his mother, then toward Hannah Brooks, offering the same calm respect to both. Hannah was still trying to process what she had just learned. She had heard Vincent DeLuca's name before, always spoken with admiration, caution, or curiosity, but never once had she imagined meeting him in such an ordinary place. Even more surprising was the realization that the gentle woman she had defended, without hesitation, was his mother. Hannah quietly apologized if she had unintentionally involved Eleanor in unnecessary attention. Eleanor immediately smiled and gently shook her head, assuring Hannah that kindness never created problems. It only revealed people for who they truly were. Vincent nodded in complete agreement. He then turned toward the customers who had remained silent during the humiliation and finally toward the man and woman whose careless remarks had begun the entire incident. No anger appeared on his face. There was no raised voice, no threat, and no dramatic display of authority. His composure alone filled the room with quiet accountability. He calmly asked a simple question. If you had believed my mother was someone important, would you have treated her differently? No one answered. The silence itself became the only honest response. Vincent allowed several moments to pass before continuing. He said that dignity should never depend upon expensive clothing, social status, appearance, age, or the name attached to a family. He explained that respect offered only to powerful people was not respect at all. It was convenience. Every word was delivered softly, yet each sentence seemed heavier than the last. The sharply dressed customer who had mocked Eleanor slowly lowered his eyes and admitted that he had behaved thoughtlessly. The woman who had laughed beside him quietly apologized as well, her voice filled with genuine embarrassment rather than fear. One by one, several customers who had witnessed the scene without speaking also stepped forward, admitting they should have defended Eleanor instead of pretending not to notice. Vincent listened patiently to every apology before looking toward Hannah once more. He told everyone gathered inside the bakery that only one stranger had chosen courage before anyone knew who Eleanor was. Hannah immediately tried to dismiss the praise, insisting she had simply followed her conscience. Vincent smiled faintly and replied that conscience was becoming far too rare in the modern world. He then turned toward the bakery manager, who still stood quietly behind the counter. Vincent thanked him for eventually showing kindness by allowing the tea to be served, but he also reminded him that true leadership inside any business begins the moment a vulnerable customer walks through the front door. Policies, elegant decorations, and premium products could never replace simple human compassion. The manager accepted those words with sincere humility and promised that every employee would receive additional training centered on respect, inclusion, and customer dignity. Eleanor looked around the room, seeing regret replace pride and reflection replace judgment. She gently reached for Hannah's hand once again and smiled with unmistakable warmth. Hannah realized that the greatest change happening inside the bakery had nothing to do with Vincent's reputation. It came from the quiet realization shared by everyone present that the person most worthy of admiration had never been the most powerful individual in the room. It had been the ordinary young woman who chose kindness long before anyone believed kindness would ever matter. The uneasy silence that had filled the bakery slowly gave way to something far more meaningful. One after another, conversations resumed, but the careless laughter that had echoed through the room earlier had completely disappeared. Instead, people spoke more softly, as though everyone had suddenly become aware that ordinary moments carried far greater importance than they had ever imagined. Hannah Brooks remained seated beside Eleanor, still slightly overwhelmed by everything that had happened. She had never defended the elderly woman because she expected gratitude from a powerful family. In fact, she still felt uncomfortable receiving so much attention for what she considered a simple human responsibility. Eleanor noticed the uncertainty on Hannah's face and gently assured her that humility often belonged to people who deserved recognition the most. Vincent DeLuca quietly thanked the bakery staff for their professionalism after the difficult situation had finally come to an end. Before leaving, he asked the manager whether the bakery regularly partnered with local charities. The manager admitted they occasionally donated unsold bread, but had never developed a consistent community program. Vincent smiled thoughtfully before suggesting something different. He offered to personally sponsor a weekly initiative providing fresh meals and baked goods for senior citizens living alone throughout the neighborhood, asking only one condition in return. Every customer, regardless of appearance, age, or financial situation, would always be welcomed with the same dignity shown to the most influential guest. The manager accepted immediately, promising that the bakery would proudly support the program. Several employees smiled with visible relief, grateful that the day had ended with hope instead of resentment. As everyone prepared to leave, Eleanor reached into her handbag and removed a small folded photograph that had clearly been carried for many years. She showed it to Hannah with a warm smile. The picture revealed a much younger Eleanor standing beside her late husband outside a modest family grocery store where they had worked together decades earlier. She explained that before her son achieved success, their family had known difficult seasons when every dollar mattered and every act of kindness from strangers had become unforgettable. She quietly admitted that was why she still preferred visiting ordinary places alone from time to time. It reminded her never to judge people by what they owned or how they appeared. Hannah listened carefully, realizing that true humility often belonged to people who had experienced both struggle and success. Vincent watched the conversation from a respectful distance, allowing the two women to share the quiet moment without interruption. For the first time in many years, he saw his mother laughing with the carefree warmth she had carried before losing her husband. He understood that Hannah had given Eleanor something far more valuable than protection inside the bakery. She had reminded her that genuine goodness still existed in the world. Before saying goodbye, Eleanor gently embraced Hannah and asked whether she would consider joining them for lunch one day. Hannah smiled politely, believing the invitation was simply a kind gesture offered in the emotion of the moment. She agreed, without expecting anything more. Vincent then handed Hannah a simple business card containing only his name and a telephone number. He explained that if she ever needed assistance finding employment, she should not hesitate to call. Hannah accepted the card with sincere appreciation but quietly replied that she hoped to earn every opportunity through honest work. Vincent's faint smile grew slightly wider. That answer confirmed everything he had already begun to admire about her character. As Hannah stepped outside into the cool afternoon air, the black vehicle slowly departed in the opposite direction while she walked toward the nearby bus stop, carrying nothing more than her worn handbag and the peaceful knowledge that she had followed her conscience. She never realized that behind the tinted window of the final sedan, both Eleanor and Vincent continued watching her disappear into the busy Manhattan crowd, already knowing that this unexpected meeting was not the end of their story, but only the quiet beginning of a bond built upon respect rather than circumstance. 3 weeks passed, and the memory of that afternoon inside the bakery quietly settled into the hearts of everyone who had witnessed it. Life gradually returned to its familiar rhythm, yet something invisible had changed. The bakery employees greeted every customer with greater warmth. Strangers found themselves lingering a little longer to hold doors open for older visitors. And the weekly meal program Vincent DeLuca had proposed quickly became one of the neighborhood's most appreciated traditions. Every Saturday morning, dozens of senior citizens gathered to receive fresh bread, warm soup, and genuine conversation instead of hurried charity. Hannah Brooks never imagined she would become part of that effort. One afternoon, after another unsuccessful job interview, she remembered the business card Vincent had given her. She hesitated for several minutes before making the call, not because she wanted special treatment, but because Eleanor's invitation had remained in her thoughts ever since they met. To her surprise, it was Eleanor who answered the telephone. Her cheerful voice immediately recognized Hannah, and before the conversation ended, she invited her to visit the community center where the meal program had begun. When Hannah arrived the following Saturday, she expected to find a small volunteer gathering. Instead, the spacious hall buzzed with quiet laughter, families arranging tables, students serving meals, and older neighbors sharing stories over fresh coffee. Eleanor greeted Hannah with a heartfelt embrace, introducing her to every volunteer as though welcoming an old friend back home. Vincent arrived a few minutes later carrying several boxes of donated books for the community library corner. Although everyone respectfully acknowledged him, he quietly set the boxes down and immediately joined the other volunteers arranging chairs and serving meals. Hannah noticed that no task seemed beneath him. Whether carrying folding tables or pouring coffee for an elderly guest, he worked beside everyone else without expecting attention. Throughout the afternoon, Hannah naturally slipped into helping wherever she was needed. She sat beside an elderly veteran whose family lived across the country, patiently listening to stories from decades earlier. She helped an older woman carefully carry her groceries to the transportation shuttle and spent nearly half an hour teaching a young volunteer how to make newcomers feel comfortable instead of hurried. Eleanor watched every interaction with quiet pride. She had wanted to discover whether Hannah's kindness inside the bakery had been a single emotional moment or a reflection of her true character. The answer became clearer with every passing hour. Hannah never looked around to see who was watching. She simply noticed people who needed help before anyone else did. As the event came to an end, Vincent found Hannah collecting empty cups long after many volunteers had already begun leaving. He thanked her for giving so much of her time. Hannah smiled gently and admitted that the day had given her far more than she had contributed. She said she had not realized how much she missed hearing older people laugh until she spent the afternoon among them. Vincent looked across the community hall where his mother was smiling. While speaking with several longtime friends, he quietly confessed that he had not seen her this happy in many years. Hannah followed his gaze before replying that sometimes people only needed someone willing to sit beside them long enough to remind them they were not forgotten. Vincent nodded thoughtfully, understanding that once again Hannah had described something much larger than the afternoon itself. As the final chairs were folded and evening sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the community center, Eleanor watched the two of them speaking with effortless sincerity. She smiled to herself, knowing that the strongest connections in life are never built upon wealth, influence, or appearances. They begin with one quiet decision to protect another person's dignity, even when no reward is expected and no one knows who is watching. Autumn arrived quietly, painting the trees surrounding the neighborhood with warm shades of gold and amber, and the small community center had become a place where familiar faces gathered every weekend with genuine anticipation rather than loneliness. What had begun as a simple meal program had slowly grown into something much greater. Local businesses contributed fresh food, students volunteered their afternoons, and families who had once hurried past strangers now stayed to share conversations across generations. At the center of those quiet changes stood people who had never sought recognition. Hannah Brooks continued volunteering every Saturday with the same humility she had shown from the beginning. She never looked for praise, never expected special treatment, and never spoke about the afternoon that had unexpectedly connected her life with Eleanor and Vincent DeLuca. To Hannah, kindness still felt like the most ordinary decision a person could make. One bright Saturday morning, Eleanor invited everyone to celebrate the first anniversary of the community program. The gathering was held in the very same bakery where everything had begun. The polished display cases remained beautiful. The scent of fresh bread still drifted through the room. Yet the atmosphere had been transformed completely. Employees greeted every guest with sincere smiles, older customers were welcomed with patient respect, and photographs from the weekly volunteer events decorated one wall near the entrance. Several of the customers who had witnessed the original incident returned that morning as volunteers themselves. The sharply dressed man who had once spoken carelessly now spent his weekends delivering fresh bread to homebound seniors. The woman who had laughed alongside him coordinated clothing drives for elderly neighbors during the winter months. Their past mistakes had become reminders of how people could change when they chose humility instead of pride. Eleanor stood before the gathered volunteers and quietly thanked everyone for believing that compassion deserved a permanent place in the community. She then invited Hannah to stand beside her. Hannah hesitated at first, embarrassed by the attention, but Eleanor gently took her hand with the same warmth she had shown on the day they first met. Vincent watched from nearby with a quiet smile. When the room settled into silence, Eleanor explained that none of the wonderful changes surrounding them had begun because of wealth, influence, or reputation. They had begun because one ordinary young woman refused to remain silent while another human being was being humiliated. Every person inside the bakery looked toward Hannah, whose eyes filled with emotion as she quietly shook her head, insisting that countless others would have done the same. Vincent softly replied that history often changes because one person chooses to act while everyone else believes someone else will step forward. The room answered with gentle applause, not celebrating status, but celebrating character. As the gathering came to an end, Hannah stepped outside onto the familiar sidewalk where months earlier she had stood beside a frightened stranger without knowing who she truly was. The afternoon sunlight reflected across the bakery windows exactly as it had on that unforgettable day. Eleanor joined her, and together they watched older neighbors leave carrying fresh bread, warm meals, and brighter smiles than they had worn when they arrived. Vincent stood quietly behind them, grateful not only for the happiness he saw in his mother's face, but also for the reminder that true strength had never been measured by power alone. It had always been measured by the willingness to protect another person's dignity when no reward was guaranteed. The busy streets of Manhattan continued moving forward, yet inside the hearts of everyone touched by that single act of courage, something lasting remained. They no longer remembered the afternoon for the humiliation that had taken place inside the bakery. They remembered it because one compassionate stranger proved that respect does not belong to the powerful alone. It belongs to every person, and on that ordinary day, the world quietly remembered what true dignity looks like.